Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the last echo of The Lord of Bells. The final chapters, everybody. This is the wrap-up. We have got chapters 76, An Unfolding Universe, 77, All is Revealed, 78, Peace and Quiet, and then the Afterword. In these chapters, I actually am really curious and gratified about a couple of the details that are dropped here. And it looks like Bierce is promising to come back to Hugh and his friends at some later point, which is a pretty fun, tantalizing little treat to lay out for us. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat celebrating that Michigan has won the national title. For those who don't know what that means, it's college football, of which there are 131 Division I football schools, which I just found out because I did not know what he meant in any sense. So, congratulations, Michigan. And I hope everybody out there has also learned something new today, because I didn't. No, 131 is a lot. So these final chapters are a lot of, like, really, it's kind of funny. So first of all, you know that I want to talk about Alustin. I'm going to wait to get there, because while I do really like this twist, the thing that I'm most interested in is the way that Bierce sets the stage for all kinds of recovery that needs to happen, because of how much of the landscape, and I mean that in both the physical, literal sense and also in the like metaphorical, political sense, has been devastated by this war. And it's honestly appreciated that we get told all the damage that was done in specifics and the ways in which certain factions have formed and how, you know, piracy has begun to take off. This is the sort of thing that I actually find really interesting. And I know that, like, this isn't the point of things, but I think it's a great thing to remind readers of as an author, that, like, just because the actual battle is over and the day is won, that doesn't mean an end to the issues. If anything, when people are still in the midst of a fight, they will sometimes be more unified than otherwise. And it's the end of the fighting where they really get tested. And I just appreciate this being pointed out at all, because there are so many fantasy novels, especially ones that feel like they're more YA. And this one is, I mean, it is, but it's certainly a more elevated YA. But a lot of them do sort of treat things as if, okay, war's over, we're done now. And the effects of everything are so extremely self-contained as to almost feel like it's a fishbowl. You know, there was just this little tempest in a teapot situation. And this is part of the thing that I know a lot of people bring up with, like, Harry Potter. They have the giant battle at Hogwarts, but it's just at Hogwarts. And while there are certainly things, like, happening in a vague sense, we're never really out there seeing them. And it's all really restrained to this one area. And it just feels like this is a global problem. So anyway, yeah. Dan says, Alustin was an interesting decision. He's such a fascinating character. I'm glad he lived. And MX Shard says, consequences never stop. that's what I think Bierce is really interested in. You know, it seems like the consequences of choices are something that he really likes to follow through and see to the end, both in terms of unintended consequences that are sort of ripple effects, but also the consequences based on the character of the people involved and how that might be really different depending on who you're dealing with. If you did the exact same thing, but you involved somebody else, how totally other this could go. So 76 starts with Hugh protesting against Canderon, who has mentioned him declaring himself her heir. And Canderon is like, you know, I'm taking this seriously. And he says that, well, it was just a political ploy to get Raymel into the war. And she's like, yeah, I don't care. We're going to have a ceremony and it's going to be a whole thing. And everybody else is laughing, but Hugh is over here kind of glowering about it. And I think you may as well. You know, I know that to a point, him agreeing to be heir or having declared himself heir is putting a target on his back, but also it's like very obvious what his relationship is to Canderon, and whether or not this was an official position that he held, I don't really think matters at this point. I believe that he is so well known and that her affection for him has been so observed that everybody would already be aware that he could be a piece used against her, and it's just really too late to call that back. And she says that she's sending him off world, and he's really upset because he's like, you just came back. Like, I don't want to separate so soon. And she's like, yeah, it's not going to be safe for you though. Like, everybody after this whole show that I put on, they're all going to be coming at me. And I'm going to be so busy that I'm not going to have time to like watch your back. And I can't be distracted by worrying about you. And she also says, sorting all the weapons that Heliathrax stored in her lair, half of which should have been within Skyhold's vault, if not for her vanity and need for trophies. And I am so curious about what some of those things were. It never really occurred to me that Heliathrax had those sorts of items because she wasn't using them. And I sort of assumed that if you had that sort of thing at your disposal, that you would just, you know, we're in the midst of a massive battle. This is like a pretty singular event. I would have expected her to pull that out, maybe, you know, so to speak, pull out all the stops. But yeah, based on the very like cursory description that we got of some of the various weapons that are in the Skyhold vault, I would love to know what the hell is going on with some of the stuff she's got her claws on or had her claws on. And she says something about how, like, they all need to reach the point of great powers and not just in, like, brief spurts. They need to be able to sit within the echelons of great powers comfortably. And it's clear that that was a little bit of a pointed remark to Talia. Oh, that's right. Dan says she didn't know where her lair was. Remember, the illusion dragon hid it. Thank you. I forgot about that. I think that I was like under the impression that she had like gotten it back before the battle, but that is not true because he was in this battle and it was a whole thing. So yeah, and she's like, we also need you to get some alien magics. And he's like, ooh, so we may have done a little bit of that already. And she seems a bit put out by it, and I was surprised. I thought she would be like, oh, you've got a head start. But it turns out that she asks, you know, where, And Sabe says, Limnan, just the first stage. And Kandaron says, an inoffensive enough choice cuts off relatively few future paths for you. And so then, it's really immediately understandable why she was sort of worried when he said this, because evidently, depending on what they pursued, it could have just shut avenues off for them. And I didn't realize that. It makes sense because you can never make a choice without sort of foregoing something else. That's just the nature of it. But the way that it seems like it would have been unintentional, that would have been a real bummer if, they had taken on Limnan magic for the fact that it seems like it was the most all-purpose and generally applicable to keeping them alive, but that they didn't realize there were other things that they were shooting themselves in the foot over. I would have been very bummed for them. So this is when she mentions ascendants, and she's like, it's not useful for ascendants, but I intend you to pursue names instead. Ascendancy is for power-hungry fools. It's little more than the great power system writ large across the multiverse. And I love this. Kandaron says something about the four of you, and Mackerel claps his covers, and she's like, okay, the five of you. Your link is the most important thing you've got going on. It's a huge advantage. So everything that y'all do it's going to have to be together, and you're going to have to acquire a lot of the same magics. And Godric mentions his elemental, but she does not seem to take that really into account. So I'm not sure if that's simply because it doesn't matter at this point in this conversation, or if Gravel is not quite advanced enough to really feel like a personality. But she says, she's talking about warlocks here and how they can develop in Limnus, and that every world has a version of warlocks, but how they work varies a lot. Your pre-existing warlock bond will allow the lot of you to share power in some fascinating ways. I've got options for different worlds you should consider, ones that are relatively safe for training, and I would personally recommend more passive magic to make you harder to kill, as well as magic that will help you handle more sensory inputs. It isn't uncommon for mages with 6 or more affinities to develop sensory processing disorders later in life. The human brain struggles to handle as many additional senses as you possess. You have many options for either, and even more besides. Ultimately, if you are to become named, the final choice must be yours, so long as you stick to certain guidelines. And that was really fascinating to me, the idea that, having all of these different senses, because they have a million affinities, and I'm exaggerating, obviously, but it would be an overwhelming amount of data, for your brain to process. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are many people with our just 5 senses that the average human is born with who get overwhelmed sensorily in the everyday world. So imagine those 5 senses and then the magical senses on top of it. And that's a lot to handle. So Sabe says, what exactly are the named? And she finally answers, a sort of multiversal great power. Not the mightiest, but the most stable. The named have a functional living ether body, a complete organism of its own, rather than the random agglomerations of etheric organs many other multiversal powers possess. They are twinned organisms existing in both the material world and the ether, sharing a single consciousness and perpetually rebuilding one another. And I love Sabe. Pretend we didn't understand what that means. It means the named are nigh immortal and live for millennia, which is among the least of their gifts. I do not intend to lose Hugh to mortality anytime soon, and I doubt he would consent to losing any of you to that. this is wild. Like, the fact that she is saying that this could be where they wind up, that they could be alive for this long, means that Beer's promising Hugh and his friends come back. You know, we're assuming they're going to come back within a regular lifetime's passage of time. A decade, not even, you know? But it would not be impossible for Beers to be like, okay, so it has been 1,000 years. Welcome back to the story. And he could have just completely wiped the board clean and started over with the world building in Anastas to a degree. And that is wild. And it's a really fun thing because, like, so many stories are about people who are pursuing immortality as their main goal, that it's like a huge a prize to be won, but that the main characters are cognizant of how foolish a goal that is, that the life that you would live were you immortal would be like less than it is when you are still within a regular lifespan, like that the choices you have to make to gain immortality sort of tear away parts of your humanity. And for this story, for the like concept of immortality to have never been brought up really as an option, that's not part of the plan, but that our guys are being offered it low key in the end. And that's like, it's being offered by somebody who can give it to them. This is not like a fantastical prize that only one of them can get their hands on. This is an option all of them could potentially achieve. It's just a really different vibe to the end of a lot of stories like this. So Hugh asks, why did Heliothrax do what she did? Why did she turn into a monster? And Candoron says fear. And basically, all of the things that she had and all of the respect and power, position, wealth, she was afraid of losing it all. This is what drives so many of the great powers. It's what drives Dorsasign in his constant pursuit of more gold. It's what drove Salintus to build his despicable little cult. What drives countless great powers out there. When you pursue power to unreasonable degrees, when you accumulate wealth and strength beyond what you could ever truly need, it brings no feelings of safety, security, or contentment. Only fear of losing what you have to the point of obsession. And she says that she pursues power for purpose, not just to have it. I have already known far greater loss than any amount of power. And this is when she leaves and she says, I love you, little one. And he says, I love you too, mother. So I thought that was a bit of a joke, but it seems like he's going to kind of low-key be calling her that. And I'm honestly not mad about it. I kind of, you know, like, it's something that's difficult for me to imagine because I have not lost a parent at such a young age and been without a parental figure that I cared about and respected. So I like the idea of simply taking a title like mother and applying it to a different person in my life. That for me feels like sacrilegious, you know, but I can't relate to this like life that he has lived. And so I actually really like this for him. It feels like declaring family. And that makes me happy for the both of them. So they go over to the Coven encampment and Talia says, have you guys heard what they've started calling us? The Hand of the Sphinx. Like a hand of cards? Or the hand at the end of an arm? Sabe finally asked. I think it's supposed to be deliberately ambiguous, Talia said. I never even thought about a hand of cards. I fully thought that it was the hand at the end of an arm. I prefer the hand of cards more because that sounds like you still have autonomy, whereas a hand at the end of an arm is like totally in control of the being moving it, which I don't enjoy. But I have to say, like, it hadn't occurred to me to see it that way. And Hugh is just sort of ambivalent about the title. And Hugh says, why would they possibly call Candor on the page of the book? Oh my God. I love that Mackerel like has a couple moments later on. They're talking about Alustin, and Mackerel's like, who's Alustin? I fell out. That was so funny to me. It turns out that he's just fucking with them, and they're just like trying to explain, like, you know who that is. And he's just kind of like, no, what? And he finally has to be like, guys, he's fucking with you. You know that, right? So let's see. Rose. Oh, this is right. Rose Carrick's comes out. Hugh wondered if any of them suspected Rhodes' identity, because he's got a bunch of High Vale officers. He braced himself for an awkward conversation with his former bully, but Rhodes just nodded politely at them and continued past, speaking with the High Vale officers. Weird, Hugh said. What's weird? It's just strange. I was expecting some sort of closure for us to talk about how he treated me, or I don't know. And Talia, for the very first time ever, is like, well, this isn't a novel, and you don't always get closure. And everybody's like, where is Talia? What have you done with her? But I really liked this. I think, I've already mentioned that kind of thing is rare, getting that sort of closure. And the fact that he just was like, well, it was funny. This is a very real thing. There are a lot of people who don't look back at their behavior and realize what they were doing. They think that it was just a bit of fun and not a big deal. And even if somewhere in their depths of their psyches they know better, they never really face that, I think that it's something that a lot of us, like those of us who do have more of a conscience, it's difficult to understand how some people can have enough self-awareness to like remember the things they've done, but not enough to judge honestly the damage that they did. And it's something that I really feel sad about. Like, there's not a way to control another person's perception of themselves and get them to really see where you're coming from. And I feel like if there were a way to do that, it would be a major step forward for all of humanity. If we could instill empathy in other people forcibly, that if they seem to lack it and we brought it to the fore, I feel like that could solve a lot of problems. But it's not possible. And Rhodes clearly is just like, I don't know if he has really grown as a person. It's unclear. I feel like if he really, really had, then maybe he would have apologized and made more of a point of it. But I also know that there are times where somebody knows they did wrong and they aren't sure whether another person that they wronged actually even wants to talk about it. Is it worse to like bring it up and force somebody to relive a trauma, or to put them in a position where they feel like you're asking them to forgive you and putting them on the spot for it? But I don't really get the impression that's something Rhodes has been struggling with. So I think maybe he's grown a little bit, and being bullied by his master helped to get him to like just have a different sense of himself. But I would have liked more in a theoretical sense. I am not saying that I would have liked more within the story, because this feels appropriate to me. So, this conversation about Alustin, and they talk about like how complicated their feelings are about him. Godric is saying, people are messy, and I'm glad my dad never got to see what he was like before he died. And at the end of the chapter, we get as the Starfire shield had filled with starfire from the outside in, Hugh had felt the faintest flicker of planar magic. And I was like, oh, word. I really was shocked. This came as a total surprise. And I had just said in the previous episode how much of a like sort of difficult thing it is to pull off the, oh, they're dead. No, they're not. And I think this was done quite well. It's just so easy to get wrong, y'all, you know? And it's easy to get wrong in the sense that you can make it feel like a person surviving seems unlikely. Or you can make it seem like you wanted there to be this big moment that shocks, but you don't want to actually commit to that and the consequences of what would happen. And I feel like this makes sense in so many different directions that it works well, because it's not just the fact that like Candoron, in terms of her attachment to Alustin and her personal feelings on the subject, would have wanted to keep him alive, but also that she would have the capability to fake his death, and that it's not Alustin faking his death, which would have a totally different, it would require him running away from consequences of his own actions, which I wouldn't like. And it would also mean that he had like somehow gotten one over on Candoron, which I'm not willing to buy. But Candoron doing it, and it being possible and believable that she would want to, it completely works. And I, as much as a big part of me still like believes he would have deserved death for everything that he did and what he put everybody through, I'm not trying to say he deserves to be kept alive. And I just feel like it works story-wise. And we'll get to the conversation that he has with her later. So this, she goes and meets with the named. And this whole conversation, you guys, again, I don't feel like I have enough information for any of this to hit the way that it should. I wanted to care more about this than I did. And I understand what Bierce is trying to do here, to like give us a teaser of some of the other beings and the other levels of advancement that are in our friend's future, and the complexities of like interspatial relationships and whatnot. But because he just sort of held back on all of this until the end of the previous book and this book, it does feel like he's dropping a whole plot thread in out of nowhere. And I wouldn't have like minded if he had just done, maybe at the end of the previous books, maybe something like a post, what do they call that? When you put like it's not an afterword, because that's actually written by the author, but I'm looking at a preface or you know what I'm talking about, guys? Oh my God, why can't I think of the word? But you could have it be just stage setting from the start and ramp up the levels of it, but make it something that we are familiar with from the beginning to a very small degree, and the details get more and more solid as we continue. And that way, by the time we get here, it would be a bit more filled in, and it wouldn't feel so very disconnected from everything else. It's just a really hard to epilogue is the word I want. Oh my God. Yeah. you could include an epilogue after each book and just be like, oh yeah, we're going to check in with these like beings that sort of were watching what was happening, you know, and their cryptic comments on the situation or something. And I don't know that it would have worked that much better. I am sort of wondering, it's like what Bierce was trying to do by including them, I almost feel like confused things more than simply leaving it all out would have done. And then having this chapter dropped in where they have this conversation and have them be completely out of nowhere, people we genuinely don't know. That has its own issues because then it can just sort of feel like a retcon. But I don't know. It just feels so out of place and frustrating as a reader to try and like get a handle on, because I want this to matter to me, but it just seems like it's a completely different story he's telling here, you know? This felt like just stage setting for a sequel series to me, says Dan. Yeah, there's that, and like hinting, oh, you know, there's a whole other level of politics going on, and I don't feel like we need to know that. It doesn't make a difference to the story whether there is or not. We don't need to know, and knowing didn't add anything to me while things were going on. I didn't feel their presence throughout. I didn't concern myself. I utterly forgot about them until we had to like get put back into their POV. And the fact that they felt so irrelevant makes it almost sort of like anticlimactic that they're meant to be highly relevant. Does that make sense? And I know that the point probably of them is to not interfere unless things cross a certain threshold. But it was just I just didn't feel it. So anyway, she comes to sit and join them, and she's a little bit hesitant at first, but she finally sits, and there's this like young man that disappears, and the Wanderer says, I found him in the lovely little valley up in the Skyreach range. Little cold this time of year, but he should be fine until we bring him back. And they are talking about the Tongue Eater, and apparently Candaron was given the charge of keeping it safe, and she considers it a failure. But the liar says that you kept it safe for 5 centuries and nobody else has done better than 2 centuries. So that's pretty great as a record. And it doesn't seem like any people are really aware that it was out. So as far as I'm concerned, go ahead and keep it, because your track record is much more solid than anyone else's. Most of Candaron was deeply displeased she wouldn't be able to be rid of the burden. There was, so far as she was concerned, no weapon more horrifying in Skyhold's vault. Even its potential utility against cold mines didn't justify its use. Better to let a world die than to activate the Tongue Eater to its full potential, to risk those consequences. Which I have to agree with, and I wish that there were a way to destroy the thing. But it seems like if there were, they would have done it. So the Wanderer says, so you are trying to become one of the unique, and it's capitalized. Everybody's just like, well, yeah, obviously. We don't get told exactly what that means. And then Candaron talks about the council can't be pleased to have you camping on their doorstep with a capital C. Your refusals to join have always rankled them. And the Wanderer's like, oh, the council's delighted with us. And they're not too mad at you either. The expansionists tried to cheat, which is, I'm assuming, the scene that we saw where they faced off with these people in Havath. Sent 2 enforcers, an incipient named, and an ascendant out to protect Havath City. We stopped them, but... And she's just like, that, wait, hold on. That would be enough to like completely turn the council against them. Why would they do that? There's no way anybody's going to like be on their side for anything in the future. And the liar's like, oh, you're concerned about the council? Like, that's not even a factor at this point. They're not crippled. They are done. They are out end of. The indexers, also capitalized, and other inward-facing factions have grown sick of their wastefulness, brutality, and failures. Kiata has already fully rejected their platform and spoken out in favor of you being raised fully to the council. And again, just like a lot of things here where we're being told about beings with titles that are capitalized, and it just feels like there is already so much to keep track of. I just don't need to know any of this. And I don't feel like I'm going to be retaining it for a sequel if it ever were to come out. I feel like this is done clumsily and that there has to be a better way to have done it. But I don't really have like a great idea mapped out or anything. It just, for me, excuse me, I know that every time we sort of come back to these beings, I feel myself mentally sort of check out a little bit because I know they're going to talk about a lot of stuff that I don't have any context for and that probably isn't going to end up mattering to me in the immediate, like situation that we're in. I had sort of wondered if their battle was going to bleed over into Havath during the major confrontation, and that didn't even happen. So I really didn't need to know about it. So there's a point where the Wanderer is talking about Kiata. He hardly ever valued ephemerals, and he barely notices when they die of old age anymore. He only values relationship measured in centuries now. I suspect he genuinely lacks the ability to understand why you gave up future power to save your warlock at this point. I think his rejection of the expansionists was as much about their high numbers of ephemerals as any more practical concerns. So evidently this is just something that can happen when people live for a long time. They begin to have like a really warped relationship with other beings because of time flow and the relative importance of those beings within the scope of things. And she's just sort of like wondering if there's going to be some difficulties with him. There was a long moment of silence as they contemplated Kiata's affliction. Well, it seems we don't have to worry so much about that from you. I bet you find yourself an heir. And Kandaron is like, yes, I have. And we cut over to then Alustin, who is realizing that he is not dead. And he is in this like ether prison where he eventually pulls out a chair and a book to catch up on some reading. And I couldn't help but laugh. Like, he pulled out a table and chairs and glasses and wine when he was about to be executed. And it would have been funny if those were the only pieces of furniture he was carrying with him. And he was just like, man, I really wish I hadn't like put those out to just be vaporized now. I could have used like, does he wish he held on to that bottle of wine? But I think that was a very convincing final moment for him. So if anything, it was put to good use to be convincing on his death. So he starts reading 6 books at once using his relay golem. And I was sort of wondering if this was going to be something that eventually maybe Kandaron would like figure out how he did it and use this as a means of processing all of the different input, because she was just talking with the rest of the crew about how it's going to be sort of overwhelming and you're going to need to use alien magics to not get completely smothered by the input. Perhaps this little trick that he has come up with here will be the way. Maybe he has cracked a code, So finally, a few hours later, Kandaron shows up. And she opens a door, and they're in a library together. And I love this. She is the size of a cat, and she's sitting at the top of one of the shelves, and it's just like, man, yeah, this is dope. I love it up here. No wonder cats like this. And I love the fact that the first thing that he thinks to ask as he looks around is, how do you keep the humidity from like screwing up these books? And she starts cracking up, and it's just like, of course, that's what you wanted to know. Oh my God. So she says, you're still a monster, engaged in reprehensible acts, and there will be ample suffering from what you've done. Given that refugee crises happen several times a year from rampaging great powers, that really is saying something. There was no Helicotan refugee crisis, Alustin sniped, but without any real heat. Kandaron stopped entirely, but didn't turn to face him. Oh yes, those awful Havathi civilians. They each and every one personally contributed to the destruction of your home, especially the children who hadn't been born yet. How evil of them. And I really liked this sort of aside that we have with him here, where he knows that what he was doing was just basically answering one horrible act with another horrible act, and it did not justify it, and it didn't excuse it. And he is looking that in the face here. And he says, it's really, what I did, you could execute me for. Like, that would be reasonable. And she's like, oh yeah, I know. Like, there's other people who have not done nearly as terrible a thing as you, and I've eaten them. And he says, I'm the most hated man on Ithos right now. Well, that's it. I don't plan to use you on Ithos. So we're looking around at this insane library. All of this is just so, and we find out that it's basically alive. And there are all of these like cargo ships that are covered in books. This is obviously like the expansion of the library that the system had been looking to connect with Kandaron, and then when it did, and it expanded suddenly in a way that it was supposed to have done, this is what it was about. And she calls it the library between worlds. Let's see, I'm sorry. I'm trying to find the really important details here. The library's own powers take care of a lot of the work. It doesn't like letting knowledge decay. The library is cousin to the labyrinths, quite possibly the single greatest creation of the labyrinth builders. It's the library's mapped reaches contain as much territory as a small continent, and its exits reach out into over 24 worlds. And he's like, well, hold on. The entrance we went through isn't on a mana well. Are we even still on Anastas? We haven't entered another universe. And she says, we have and haven't. The library itself is a pocket universe. Since it always emerges in libraries or other great collections of knowledge, the librarians between worlds hardly have cause to complain. There are dozens of connections to this place in our world. And he's like, I was working for you in the Grand Library for years, and I never saw any hint. And she's like, yeah, you did. What was one of the first things that you were taught? And he realizes many of the books of the Grand Library don't seem to come from our world. I always told others that the library's strange behavior came from interactions with the labyrinth, but no, it came from interactions between my planar magics and the library between worlds. And no matter how strongly the expansionists tried to keep the two separate, they perpetually leaked into one another. So this is where the multiversal organizations work from. And he says this was where the destruction of Helicote was plotted. Kandaron gave him a gentle look. The destruction of Helicote was plotted in Havath City, Alustin. The Dominion may have been backed by one faction of the Library Council, but the strategies of imperialists are perpetually vile on their own without needing outside guidance. And he keeps thinking about how, like, he still wants to find somebody to blame. But he is trying to keep in mind the approach that Hugh and his friends are taking and seeing a desperate need for revenge as an obstacle instead of a goal to keep striving for. And she says, "You have proven yourself an exceptional weapon. And even apart from multiversal factions, the expansionists have left a lot of nasty little empires. I need your help cleaning them up. You're a blunt instrument. I intend to turn you into a scalpel. You'll need more training first, and I'll leave you the choice of what magics you acquire. But I think you'll agree about Cometrius. I'll also need your help training more librarians errant in my style. The Library Between Worlds has its own ironically. Kiata stole the idea from the library and I stole it from him before I even knew the Library Between Worlds existed. I still have 2 other questions. Now that Indris is dead, why did you ever have me steal her egg?" And she's like, "Well, I just wanted Ataerg to not find out about her affair, but it was too late. He already knew. And I also wasn't prepared for her to have such an extreme reaction to the theft. So that just really didn't go the way I expected." And he's like, "Oh, I really thought there was going to be a whole, like, long-term plan for it and that you were going to do experiments." And she's like, "No, there's a little Sphinx family that adopted it and now they're raising a dragon," which is very adorable. And then he says, "I can understand why you faked my death on other grounds, but I hurt Hugh. How can you possibly forgive me that?" Kandaron sighed heavily and looked away as though struggling to find her words. When a child hurts their sibling, what kind of parent delivers death as a punishment? "Oh," Alustin said, completely lost for words. "If I had cared for you better, treated you as the hurt child you were when I met you, rather than turning you into a weapon, none of this might have happened. None of this might have turned out this way. My own failures as a parent are as much at fault here as your own rage and resentment." And I really liked this explanation. Her seeing them both as her children and siblings, and him and his behavior as like a failing on her part. I think this is very moving and holds together really well. And I also think that this is something that can be borne out sometimes. So I hear. I don't have siblings. But I have heard people say that, like, they had multiple children and they felt like they did a better job with the second child because they had a chance to practice, whereas with the first kid, they got the shitty first rounds, of these inexperienced parents just fucking muddling through doing their best. And that's not always the case. Sometimes people don't intend to have a second kid, and so they're not prepared, if anything. And it turns out to be a surprise addition to the family. But I could see her growing enough with Hugh and thus realizing the ways in which she overlooked Alustin's very real emotional needs. And she understands better now, and the ways that she could have done things and the priorities that she should have had but didn't. And I just thought this was really, like, very beautiful, and I liked the explanation a lot. I'm really curious what's going to happen when people begin to find out, because she's going to have him training other people, and whether those people tell others I don't think that's going to happen, but there are going to have to be people that she involves in this who do think he's dead. And are they going to have an issue with it when they find out that he has, as many people might see it, been promoted, if anything, you know? So the chapter ends with him thinking over his future, grieving for Valia and for Arthur, for Emonson. And the last mind shard kept turning Candoran's confession over and over again in his mind. So then chapter 78, 3 months after the last echo rang, 3 months after Havath City fell, Hugh and his friends found themselves once more off-world. This time, though, they actually had guides who spoke the language. This is so funny. They're on a beach, and it's like a regular beach, and none of them can comprehend this, but it turns out they can. It's simply that they found out this, like, guide expected them to basically be like country bumpkins, and they found it so irritating that they decided to lean into it and make this person angry. And it is really, really funny. There's the whole thing with Godric and looking around, and I don't like these crabs. And the guide is just like, they're very small. They don't even barely hurt. They're scared of people. I've just had really bad experiences with crabs, Godric explained. And I don't know why it got me so bad, but that line had me cracking up. Just like, I think it's because there's such a long paragraph of explanation as to why he shouldn't worry about the crabs, that him just being like, no, but trust me, it was not good. I laughed so hard at that. I really did. Most of their training was in languages. There were, it turned out, no widely available translation magics accessible, so they needed to learn more than a few. And normally this would be a difficult thing for them to do because Ithonian speakers have difficulty with languages because of the tongue eater having been used, and it has lasting effects. It says Rhaegon's magic, however, was the next best thing to translation magic. It boosted memory capabilities and sensory processing significantly. It would be another couple of months before it really started kicking in for them, unfortunately. It was acquired in stages over time. For now, they just have to tough it out and struggle through their language lessons. After another 6 months, they'd be able to pick up new languages, though the struggle was well worth it. They didn't want to spend too much time on Rhaegon, of course. Later stages of its magic became progressively stranger, even awful. By late Middle Age, inhabitants of Rhaegon became profoundly alien beings as they accumulated unnaturally larger numbers of memories each day, and their thought processes warped to a degree seldom even seen among Anastan dream mages. The elderly were universally incapable of functioning at all, even to feed themselves. They were storing years' worth of memory every day. They remembered every noise, every falling leaf, every smell, until those useless memories outweighed their memories of family, friends, even language. And that sounds like a really horrible way to go. That sounds awful. This was like, oh, what a cool advantage at first. And then as you hear more about it, you're just like, oh my God, guys, get out of there. I know that they shouldn't, but it felt like, I just feel like I just don't want to be here at all. I just don't like the risk. Most multiversal visitors only stayed here a few years at most. Hugh and his friends wouldn't have to worry about their own minds being warped like that. Look, I'm sure that you don't, but things happen. What if you got stuck here? I just don't like it. It makes me anxious, you guys. It really does. The updates they received from Anastas were as bad as they'd feared. Open warfare was halted, but a simmer of guerrilla mage warfare was ongoing. And I'm not going to go into all of this, but I mentioned a lot of this before. And even in places where the war hadn't directly touched, there's still a lot of ripple effects that happened. And it says the now independent provinces of the Dominion were coming close to war with each other. Some were trying to reunite the Dominion. Only no one could agree where their new capital should be or who should lead it. Others were determined to hold to their new independence, but threatened conflict with their neighbors over the exact lines of borders or resource issues. And then it turns out the Greywise River was poisoned. Enough alchemical toxins had leaked into it from the ruined means of the Intertwined that even if times were peaceful, it would have taken years for mages to clean up the river. There was also the new great power that had been born from the merger of the 9-metal blade and its wielder. The new person that had resulted from their mind merge was a mixed blessing. They seemed dedicated to protecting former Havati subjects, but they were highly erratic and unpredictable, and no one was quite sure whether they'd ever fully become sane. I don't love that. Like, that just feels, I mean, how did that even happen? It was born from, like, what? I just am so curious about exactly how that sort of thing spontaneously happens. The only bright spot was in the south. The Rust Queen didn't have much love for her former masters. In return for Kandaron helping her gather her family, the Rust Queen had become a queen in truth, uniting 3 southernmost former provinces into a single kingdom that served as a buffer against Sika. And they are still out here with their ambitions. It would take years to clean up from the Seekan invasion. Between the poisons they'd used, the topsoil they'd drained utterly of nutrients with their plant magic, and the various floral booby traps they'd left behind, they'd turned much of the region into a hellish wasteland. And I'm sure it was mentioned, but I did not recall that using their plant magic means that they leave the ground behind them just completely drained of, like, minerals and whatnot. But again, the consequences of things. That's what Bierce is so interested in, and that feels like, you know, it just makes practical sense. So yeah, this is everything that Kandaron is, like, going around, managing negotiations, observing, and he was just like, I do not envy her. And he has never confronted her about his suspicions with Alustin. His friends, apparently he, like, shared his suspicion with them, and they are curious, but they had never asked him to really, like, say anything to her and find out for sure. And it seems they all sort of agree that it's better to not know, because their feelings about Alustin are so complicated that they just don't really want to face that right now. For now, Hugh and the others didn't need to worry about any of the ongoing crises. Not the chaotic political situation, the rumors of what was going on in the greater multiverse, not even Alustin. They just needed to study new languages, gain a new magic, and rest. After years of near constant crisis, they were finally getting a chance to just breathe again. It still seemed unreal to him. Part of him was still convinced that a monster would jump out at them at any moment, or that they'd get embroiled in some sort of civil war or something absurd like that. Learning to let his constant guard down was an endless struggle. But every now and then he managed. Every now and then he was able to relax and just enjoy his time with his friends. As he snuggled with Talia in the hammock overlooking the beach, Hugh took another deep breath and slowly let it out. He could get used to this. And I really, really like this ending. Literally just like we're vacationing on a beach. And this is the sort of thing that, like, a part of me is almost going, I wish that you went, like, on with this a little bit more. I wouldn't have minded spending a full day with them down here as they just chill and process a little bit, you know, because that's some of my favorite stuff in any story when you've got, like, a ensemble cast, so to speak. Them having downtime and seeing the way they interact with each other can be some of my favorite stuff. And they deserve a break. They really do. It's the sort of thing that I wish we could do for all of our friends. I have so many friends who are just exhausted and overwhelmed and have been dealing with one emergency after another lately. And if I could just take them to another universe and let them relax on a beach and be away from everything for a little bit, I would fucking do it. So this is when we go over to the Afterword. And Bierce is just thanking everybody for following along and telling us that he is going to be writing more with Talia and Hugh and Sabe and Godric. But it will be a while. And he says that writing this changed his life. So evidently the Mage Errant series was really like what sort of catapulted him into being able to do this full time, which I'm always interested in, like, exactly how this all happens for writers, because obviously I wouldn't mind this happening also, but I have to write first, which is just, you know, a tiny little detail. And I also wonder exactly how he got the following that he did. There's a podcast I was listening to the other day where they were talking about how it used to be that, like, in the publishing industry, they would not even want to look at you to give you a publishing deal unless you had a certain number of followers and stuff. And that the reason that self-publishing was an advantage so much at the time was because you didn't need to get that kind of, like, social media presence. But that now there are so many people self-publishing even that you still need to do that, whether you're getting looked at by a publisher or you're doing it yourself. And I always wonder how they manage to, like, get to a point where everybody is hearing about their work, because it can't be as simple as just write something really good. There's a lot of good stuff out there that doesn't get noticed. And I just really wouldn't mind asking him some questions about this. He says, I'm already hard at work on the next series, More Gods Than Stars, a new, weird, inspired sword and sorcery trilogy. It's set on Ishvios, a habitable gas giant moon with a mimic-based ecosystem, millions of gods, ranging from powerful city gods to the gods of individual kitchens and street corners, and a megastructure arcology city growing unstoppably across the land. There were even a few hints about it here in the last echo of The Lord of Bells. That sounds wild, first of all. I don't even know what arcology means. I'm going to look it up in a second. And the mimic-based ecosystem, what does that even mean? When I think mimic, I just think of that movie. Arcology, a portmanteau of architecture and ecology, is a field of creating architectural design principles for very densely populated and ecologically low-impact human habitats. All right, noted. If you have questions or comments, you can get at him at John_Bierce, or on Reddit, u/John Bierce, or johnbierce.com. Special thanks to my beta readers, Travis Riddle, Tobias Begley, Sarah Lynn, Andrew Rowe, Maxwell Siegel, Sundeep, that's a dope name, Agarwal, Otto Schlogel, Carissa Williams, F. James Blair, Gregory Gleason, and Samuel Hinton. And I love that he names them all. He names all of his Patreon subscribers on the $5 level, which is a long list, so I won't be going through that. But I just think that's, like, very precious that he names all of them at the end of the book. And then at the end, it's titled Ethereid, and he says, Mage Errant is part of the Ethereid, a set of stories by me that are all located in the same overarching multiverse. So Mage Errant, The Rack, and More Gods Than Stars are all part of that. And then he recommends some series after this. The Umbral Storm, Book 1 of the Sharded Few. Titan Hoppers, Book 1 of Titan Hoppers. Soul Relic, Book 1 of Manifestation. And Mark of the Fool, Book 1 of Mark of the Fool. Mageling, Book 1 of Millennial Mage. And Blood of a Novice, Book 1 of the Eternal Ephemera. I love these names. I really do. So anyway, just for future reading for all of you out there listening, maybe you might be interested in one of those. All right, I'm going to have to wrap this up, but I have one more episode covering this book series, and we're going to be doing a wrap-up. So if you've got questions, suggestions, information that you think I should have, go ahead and hop in the Discord or email me, and I will try and make sure to include all of that in the next episode. Thank you all again. Thank you, Dan, for commissioning this. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.